I suggest we start. I was thinking that maybe the panel should move to you if you don't want to move to the panel. But maybe we wait for a couple other people to join and hope that those seats will not be empty. In any event, if any of the people on that end would like to move closer, now is the moment. We want to talk about a couple of things here and do several tasks. One of them is to talk about, in general, the modernization, the European economic modernization agenda and clean tech, and what it means for the region. Secondly, we want to talk about China's role and how China is involved in the European industrial modernization and how it uses the clean technologies for to its benefit. Thirdly, what is China's geopolitical role in the Balkans, and especially in Serbia? And to square that circle, we have actually a very good panel, and I'm very grateful to all three of you for agreeing to speak to us today. We will start with Julian Popov, former Minister of Environment of Bulgaria, who is also a senior advisor of the European Climate Foundation and council member of the European Council on Foreign Relations. So he might have asked to talk to us a little bit about how the European debate is looking like at the moment that when we talk about green lash and what is happening with the so-called Draghi agenda. Then I have my colleague Alicja Bachulska, who came from Warsaw. She's actually a China expert, so she's gonna introduce China in this discussion, how China sees its openings in Europe and especially in Central and Eastern Europe. And then Vuk Vuksanovic, whom you probably all know, here from Belgrade, who will zoom in on the geopolitical side of the equation, especially vis-a-vis the region. I hope it's going to be an interactive debate, so please feel free to interrupt us and raise your hands also during the discussion. With that, I will pass the floor to Julian.
Thank you, Vessela. So the question, what is going on and whether something is changing on the European scene, one simple answer is no, nothing's changing. And there have been major change in narratives, in headlines, in emotions about, okay, we are out of the Green Deal, that's in the past. It's not. A few weeks ago, the European Council, and then it was supported by the European Parliament, agreed on the interim target for reduction of emissions of 90% by 2040. Everything else basically doesn't matter. So that there is some retreat on ESG reporting, 1 year delay of ETS2 and various things like that. They're not changing anything substantially. The target is there. So whether we'll achieve it or not is a different thing. 5% of this target could be achieved by international credits, which are called high-quality credits. So, but in a very typical political way, the words come before their meaning. So it was said high-quality credits, and now we have to decide what high-quality credit means. But one way or another, whether it's a couple of percentages up or down, this remains as target. What that means that the pace of reduction of emissions will stay as it is, will accelerate even. That also means that the industry, the European industry, has to fully decarbonize by 2040. So that's it, because the last 10% will go mostly to agriculture, land use, I mean, this more complicated areas. Am I right? Yeah, okay, if Svetla says so. And so that basically in 15 years, we have to get rid of fossil fuels in the industry. Obviously, if you start arguing with people, especially in social media, they will tell you that this is not possible, that is not possible, China is doing that, I don't know, America, Trump said this, but one way or another, that's the direction. And what that means in terms of basically that means that the climate priority in terms of industry, reducing emissions, stays there, and it fixes, cements its ambition. The other priority is declared, explained in the Draghi report, that we are lagging behind in terms of competitiveness. And there is the third priority, which is defense, which is 5% of the GDP has to go to security and defense spending. So we have a picture in which if we get these three priorities together, which are strongly supported by very strong and massive political constituencies, and none of them will budge and step back. If we put them together and look at them separately, the budget doesn't work. I mean, we'll run into 10% budget deficit, high inflation, and it just doesn't work. The good news, however, is that we can work, and I think we must work very hard to find the overlap between these three priorities. The problem is that if you go to any military person and mention climate, they'll say, yes, I know that it's a very serious question. I read an article about African climate refugees in 20, 30 years, but now we have a war to fight. If you go to climate activists and say, well, we have to talk to the military people, they will say, and I'm quoting literally what I've been heard, I'm not going to greenwash the warmongers. So they don't want to talk to each other. But the reality is that the technology of war, which we see now developing and winning the battle in Ukraine, is actually, not for climate reasons, but it's a low-carbon technology. So Russia, with its 4,200 planes, do not have any control of Ukrainian airspace, not because of Ukraine having 10,000 planes, but because of drones, cyber jamming, space technologies, intelligence, and so on. The same is the case with the Russian Navy. Half of it is on the bottom of the Black Sea, the other half does not dare getting out of port. And again, it's not because Ukraine has 5 aircraft carriers, but because of autonomous devices that are flying or going underwater, and then the Russians can move. So there is a major change in defense technology. This defense technology is a major advance of European competitiveness, and this technology and this advance in industrial competitiveness is serving very, very well the climate goals without referring to climate goals at all, even rejecting them, even saying we don't want to have anything with climate, and we're rapidly reducing our emissions. So that's kind of the situation in which I think we are now.
when we talk about competitiveness, however, maybe you can expand a little bit on that. When we talk about competitiveness, we talk a lot about energy, and the energy debate also in this region is a very geopolitical debate. So can you maybe also include that element in the conversation, talking about the 2040 target?
Yes, of course. Long live Donald Trump on that point, because the sanctions on Russian gas and oil, mainly industry, is doing a very good job at the moment, because it's shaking the Russian gas and oil companies on one hand. On the other hand, his push for replacing Russian gas with American gas is not going to work. So that's a very good combination. On one hand, he is doing something good for the wrong reason, but at the same time, the wrong reason will not materialize. In terms of, because Europe is very clearly declining. The trend of gas consumption is declining. I mean, there was a tiny little bit increase last year, 2024, but otherwise, in the last 3-4 years, after the spike of 22 of the high prices, gas consumption is going down rapidly. This is partly because of various European regulations, but mainly because of, and mentioning competitiveness, competition rather, here again, it's because of the very rapid expansion of renewables on a purely market basis, and specifically solar. In the last 2 years, we're seeing also rapid and unexpected expansion of large-scale batteries. Large-scale batteries are getting into direct competition with gas because they're displacing gas, starting to displace gas in the balancing role, because gas is not a transitional fuel as the gas industry wants to present it. And that is quite clear if you look at the data. So that's clearly the transitional role is taken out from the gas role. Now the balancing role will be taken out. At the same time, the electrification of transport is moving very, very fast. It's moving very fast, mainly in Europe and in China, but also all over the world. An analysis of Bloomberg New Energy Finance shows that in the last few years, electrification of transport reduced use of oil products by 2%. This is massive because the oil market is very inelastic, and if you increase or reduce supply or demand, that affects the price immediately. So this is one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why we see the oil price staying around between $60 and $65 rather than going up, despite all the sanctions, all the. I mean, if 10 years ago somebody started blowing up oil refineries in Russia, the price of oil would have skyrocketed. Now the whole world is adjusted, and so electrification of transport, electrification of heating are moving fast. So they will not, basically the market will not allow the $750 billion headline deal that Trump and Ursula von der Leyen announced for import of American energy commodities to materialize. It will just shrink.
Great, thanks a lot. You mentioned EVs, electric vehicles. You mentioned large-scale batteries, but also you talked about war. And I think China is kind of the missing third in all those conversations. So I will ask now Alicja maybe to fill that gap.
Thank you very much, Vessela. I will now zoom out and try to bring into the picture China, an actor that I'm afraid very often, if I look at the European debate, is very rarely acknowledged directly and articulated as an actor that has a huge stake in these developments. And I do understand the political reasons behind it, that European economic security debate wants to be country agnostic. It doesn't theoretically want to name and shame. But at the same time, I do have some fears regarding the fact that what seems to be a country agnostic approach sometimes is also a representation of a lack of acknowledgement of the scale of the problem and how much of an impact it will have on Europe in the long run. And here I would like to stress that for China, climate, green technologies and clean tech is not about doing climate policy for the sake of climate policy. It's about much, much more. It's about industrial policy, it's about security, and it's about combining these elements to create or reshuffle the international balance of power so that China can, in the future, near future, I would say, create new value chains that are China-centric and almost completely dependent on China. And this has never been a secret. If you look at Chinese documents, if you look at, for example, the 5-year plans or industrial policy documents such as Made in China 2025, it has always been out there. Like, we've had it on the record, but I think that Europeans over the past 10 years or 15 years have failed to acknowledge or read these documents at face value. There was a lot of wishful thinking, and there was also a period where I think now quite naively, there were politicians or decision makers who still wanted to look at China as this responsible international player who is doing climate policy because it just acknowledges it as a big shared issue that we have to focus on collectively. And of course, I'm not trying to say that China is at the moment a climate denialist in any way, because there is a big fear, for example, about food security, about livelihoods of people, where many Chinese regions are very prone to natural disasters. But this is only one element of this bigger picture. The real thing that is at stake for the Chinese Communist Party is the future dominance over the technologies of the future. And the CCP has designated clean tech around 10 years ago, or even before, but in the Made in China 2025 strategy, clean tech was designated as this core area of competition where Beijing wanted to achieve dominance in order to be more secure in the competition with the US, but also in economic competition with the West more broadly. And this boils down to what is now called in China the dual circulation strategy. That's the official strategy of the government in Beijing to, on the one hand, domestically create a large demand for clean tech, for example, look at EVs, by not only subsidizing domestic production and creating a lot of competition between local actors, but also by selectively building links with third countries and third markets in order to build these very unequal relationships and dependencies in the technologies of the future. And that's what we're seeing at the moment. So if you zoom in on the CEE region, and although, of course, this region is very diverse and there are countries where it's easier for China to have these inroads locally because of varying local structures, institutions, political cultures, and so on, it's very clear that China has tried to exploit these quite optimistic assessments of what cooperation with China on the climate front might look like. But what it actually means, seen from Beijing, is that if CEE countries engage with China on the same in the same manner as before, we are going to end up, and this is a big simplification, but I will still say it, that we are going to end up as an assembly line of Chinese products that will be cheaper than European products, probably much more innovative, and we already see it on the EV front. But also they would pose security threats. They will mean deindustrialization of European value chains and also the CEE value chains that are very tightly interlinked with, for example, the German value chains. So it's a very big kind of a picture where China is not doing what it's doing because it's a market economy that wants to compete and wants to do climate policy for the sake of climate policy. It's much, much bigger. And if we don't acknowledge that, and if we don't look at how targeted China has been also in the CEE region when it comes to specific sectors, specific countries, and how it has been trying to approach local elites to build these dependencies, we are losing the big picture, and we are then also becoming increasingly unable to create an orchestrated response to deal with this challenge.
Maybe you can zoom in even further and talk a little bit about electric vehicles, because this is an area where Chinese competition to European and especially Central European, but also German car makers is at its most critical point right now. The other one is probably wind turbines
lithium batteries as well.
And lithium batteries. So maybe if you can talk us through that briefly.
I would probably focus on the EVs, as I think that this is one of the most visible representations of these developments on the ground in Central and Eastern Europe. China has been trying to make these inroads to forge cooperation with local partners for quite a few years now. And the thing is that in the minds of, and I'm here talking, for example, about Poland, my country of origin, business elites and some parts of the political elites from both the current coalition, liberal coalition government and the previous conservative government, they saw China and cooperation with China on the EV front and as something very beneficial for the local economy, with very high expectations towards how China could invest in local production and how it could cooperate with local entities to create more value added. The expectation was that there would be a way of convincing China to create a level playing field in this domain. So, for example, to have some kind of an agreement where technology transfer would be enabled, to retain some of this value added here in Europe, in Poland, in Central and Eastern Europe, and not to move the whole production to China in order then for these ready products to be reassembled in Europe. And although this was a process, a debate among politicians and Chinese counterparts for many, many years, and among politicians coming from very, very different ends of the political spectrum in Poland, which is very polarized, the end game at the moment is that nothing has been achieved. China is extremely reluctant to treat CEE partners as equals. And this also applies to even, German automakers. Look at the stage of what's happening with the German auto industry, how its piece of the Chinese market is shrinking, how Chinese behavior on the ground in China is pushing out European automakers, especially the German ones, from the market, and how this will also affect local small and medium enterprises in Central and Eastern Europe. And those are vital elements of this value chain. And we might not yet see it at the moment firsthand. We're kind of seeing it on the horizon, but I think that the momentum has not yet been built, and it might already be somehow too late. At ECFR, we have an office in the center of Warsaw, and over the past 6 months, I think that we had at least 4 huge BYD billboards right in front of our windows, plus Yes, it was especially for us. And then the number, I've heard that the number of Chinese EV sellers that opened their offices in Warsaw over the past 8 months is around 16 at the moment. And this is a development from, like, it's less than a year. And you can see those cars on the streets. And these are not EVs per se, these are hybrid plug-ins because of the local circumstances, but these cars are out there, and it's very hard to imagine how now decision makers could reverse this trend.
And they're good.
And they're good.
Okay, they're good and probably less expensive. So China has an industrial strategy in Europe, but it also has a geopolitical kind of set of intentions. And I will ask Vuk to move the conversation to Southeast Europe and to explain how you feel China is trying to make its footprint look like here.
Thank you very much. Now, when I was invited to contribute to this panel, I sort of felt like an intruder. I am not quite sure that I can provide the specialist granular input that some of my other co-panelists did, but I'm a political and geopolitical animal, so perhaps the big picture overview, the big picture background is perhaps something where I can provide at least some form of contribution to this panel. Now, when it comes to this small corner of the world, this armpit of the universe called the Balkans, now the quite natural thing is what is the thing that the Chinese are attracted to. While for a very long time the Western nations had a very cliche, almost semi-oriental view of this region as something of Europe's periphery, the powder keg cliche, I mean ethnically fragmented territory burdened with ethno-religious dispute, poor corruptive governance, and of course susceptible to great power meddling, the Chinese were just taking a look at the geographical map. And they saw that of the 3 Mediterranean European peninsulas, the Iberian, Apennine, and the Balkan Peninsula is the closest to Middle East and North Africa in terms of maritime routes. And if you take into account Turkey, it's also the closest one in terms of land routes to wider Eurasia. And so, for the Chinese, it was simple. If we want to connect ourselves with one of our biggest markets, the European Union, we have to achieve a Balkan footprint. And on that point, 4 countries, if you just want to take a look which countries, not just in the Western Balkans, but wider Southeastern Europe are most important for the Chinese, you just have to take a small pen on a map and start connecting the dots. Port of Piraeus, Greece. Go up north, North Macedonia, where just by accident some of the corruption in the background of constructing some of the highways have also paved the way for the ouster of corrupt Prime Minister Nikola Gruevski in 2016, but that same company keeps implementing the same contracts even though Gruevski is gone for 9 years already. Go up north, what do you have? You have Serbia, a central country in the Balkans, which also happens to be a country where the Balkan Peninsula connects itself with Central Europe. Here where we are right now, north of River Danube, that's actually Central Europe, not the Balkans. So, and where do we go next? We have something called Belgrade-Budapest Highway, and then we are in Hungary. One moment you're in the Mediterranean transporting goods from Eurasia, and the next one you're in heart of Europe. Now, of course, Chinese have penetrated a whole set of sectors here. There is infrastructure lending, economic takeover of old industrial facilities that European and Western investors were shy to take ownership. We had technology. We had medical equipment during COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, we also have security cooperation and intensified political dialogue between 2 leaderships. Now, of course, some of these sectors are more important than others in understanding both the Chinese logic and some of the local give and take ways, so to speak, some of the local trade-offs that we must understand. For example, we have seen Chinese penetration of Serbia's extractive industry, primarily steel mill in Sarajevo, taken over by Hestil Group, and the copper mining complex in Bor, taken over by Zijin Mining. I mean, in all three cases, we have the following pattern. On one hand, China is this industrial production behemoth, and no amount of resources is too big for China to swallow. Every time they will say the amount of copper and the amount of steel which goes from these two to China. At the same time, not all of these things go to China. Steel from Smederevo doesn't just end up in China, it also ends up in Europe. So, again, China, which believes that no resources is small enough for it, and number two, it's also a way to connect itself with the European market, while at the same time building influence with local corruptive elites which are receptive to the Chinese capital. So, not two birds, but three birds with a single stone, essentially. At the same time, of course, we have, as a result of it, we have seen a very, very significant fallout from it, where some people have even spoken about China outsourcing its pollution to the other countries. But where do I see the biggest takeaway, the biggest trend in the future? I think that the Chinese economy is slowing down. Of course, it is a gigantic economy, so it is still a percentage that many of us would die over, but still it is slowing down compared to what has been the norm for the past 3 or 4 decades in China. So the Belt and Road Initiative also has to transform, and I expect that one of these transformations will be that the Chinese will be much more inclined to invest not necessarily in pure infrastructure, but to observe at the quality and not just the quantity of its investments, which means that Belt and Road Initiative has the potential, for example, to refocus itself to new technologies and, of course, new alternative energy infrastructure to be the new remit of the project. But where do I see the biggest question mark? And I presume that we might reach to this later on. I don't think that Europe is the biggest check on Chinese regional ambition here. I think it is the US. Because I think that from the standpoint of every country on planet globe, including Serbia, the key one will be how to navigate in a world of Sino-American rivalry. And I have a theory how Belgrade will respond. I think that what will happen is that all the analogies with former Yugoslavia will kick in. Cold War, we've been here before. We know how this game is played. And so they will say China will be our political friend. We will accept money from the Chinese when we can. But when it comes to areas which Washington deems as strategic ones, whether it is 5G, whether it is lithium, whether it is purchasing high-tech defense systems from China, on those points we will have to keep the Chinese out. So whether Chinese will have the potential to penetrate new technologies here in the Balkans, they absolutely can. But how far they will go, that ultimately depends on whether the US also deems these technologies and these sectors as strategic. The new situation where, of course, after 5 years wait, it is the American institution which will finance the 5G rollout in Serbia, not the Chinese, I think is sort of a foreshadowing of this pattern of behavior that is to follow. And those are my 5 cents, so thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Can I ask you to add a couple of sentences on the very specific lithium case? Because Alicja also mentioned the lithium batteries as one of the battlefields and of that rivalry. And obviously for Europe, Serbia has a key role to play because of that particular aspect, because Europe is not rich in rare earths.
Okay. Now, I have to underscore something that before the Novi Sad canopy tragedy happened, which triggered the protest and political crisis which we are living to this very moment, the biggest political crisis facing this regime has been the domestic fallout regarding lithium. Of course, Novi Sad happened and no one talked about lithium. And I was at a dinner with several foreign ambassadors in the background of last year's Belgrade Security Conference, so a year before where we are now. And during a small presentation that I gave, I told them that, yes, Chinese may be losers of the canopy tragedy long term. The Belgrade regime is definitely the loser of the canopy collapse. But one thing that I said, but I think that the biggest loser of the canopy collapse is the company which was supposed to lead the lithium exploitation project, which is Rio Tinto. I told them that if I were a political risk consultant hired by investors to do a market analysis on Rio Tinto, I said that after canopy collapsed, Rio Tinto shareholders have a high potential of actually losing their money as a result of it. Because this was the most politically tense issue in the country even before the canopy collapsed. In a highly polarized Serbian society, this new environmentalism was probably one of the rare things which unified both political left and political right, and one of the things which was opposed both by Vucic's opponents and both by some of his voters. And so I think that after Novi Sad happened, now they are saying European Union is giving us memos guaranteeing that this will be done according to the highest standards. The Serbian government is guaranteeing that it will be better standards. After canopy collapsed, no way can I trust the incumbent regime that this one will be done in environmentally and conscientious form. So the biggest problem that I see for Rio Tinto or for anyone who has ambitions regarding this project is, number one, Rio Tinto has now become one of the symbols of Vucic's era. Whether we can debate whether this company should have done a better communication strategy, whether this company already had a bad rep from some of the other projects it has implemented overseas, we can debate that, but in the minds of many people, Rio Tinto and lithium is one of the symbols of Vucic's era. Vucic is so domestically vulnerable that he doesn't have the political power to push this project domestically, and I'm not quite convinced that Vucic's successor will have that potential either.
Great. The floor is open. Any comments, any reactions, any thoughts? Kurt.
Sorry. Kurt Bassiner, Democratization Policy Council. Just a few reactions. I mean, I'm drawing on the themes that all three speakers brought. And I'll try to bring it back to one of the themes that is a motivating factor for me being here, which is the EU's potential posture, which it's not actually representing, in my view, as a values exponent in geopolitical competition. Usually those are considered polar opposites. If you deal with geopolitics, values leave the room. We've got to talk about strategic interests. If the EU thinks it's going to outcompete its geopolitical competitors in transactionalism, it's dead meat. Game over. I think that's a delusion. And this is a teachable moment on that, because the way that this project has been sold, this is good for you, trust us, not just by the Serbian government, by the way, is not only unbelievable. There are three fundamental questions. Under what terms are these things going to be pursued, these extractive projects? Under what standards are they going to be undertaken, and who's going to enforce said standards? Saying it's going to be European standards, well, how the hell are they going to enforce that? And three, where the hell does the money go? Does it go for the betterment of society or not? And in theory, all three of those could be a yes. In practice, and it's not just in Serbia, there's no way in hell you can answer those in the affirmative. And no external actors have contended with that. We're seeing that in Bosnia with the Vareš mining project. It's a regional phenomenon and not just here. In essence, because of the strategic prioritization, the West is plugged into the network of state capture to get what it wants. And it's been quite open. Jan Koopman has basically said it, he's offered the arms, making arms available for Ukraine. Okay, legit. Lithium, and what was the third thing that he mentioned? He mentioned three things that fall completely outside the ambit of enlargement as reasons he had confidence Serbia was going to advance in enlargement. So you could see that yes, that's it. It was the Rafales, that's correct, which, okay, that's even national. So I guess my point is that if the European Union wants to build credibility at a popular level, have a popular constituency for its agenda, which has always been ignored because the EU operates government to government. Yes, they have projects, but in reality, they've never treated the people of the Western Balkans as a constituency. They're talking about their values facing east completely correctly after 2022. They're not doing it here, and they haven't been doing it here for at least 15, 16 years as a frontline thing. It's been transactional on Europe's part, too. So I'd love to get reactions to that and ideas on how to remediate that problem, if you agree with my characterization of it.
And also, because we know that there is the German foreign minister is going to visit, or has he? No, he hasn't yet. He has been here already? I don't know if there was a talk about that industrial part of the cooperation.
When it comes to the German foreign minister, your guess is as good as mine, even though that may have been mentioned behind closed doors. But from what I can see, the domestic situation in Serbia, as well as its potential alignment with EU's foreign policy, probably played a much greater role at this moment in time rather than the issue of lithium. Even though I would say that, yes, the case study of lithium is perhaps the perfect microcosmos of how basically Serbian society got disillusioned with the European Union. Because I will tell you, late 2023, early 2024, we had a political crisis regarding fraudulent Belgrade elections. And our organization, Serbian, was very active during this part in raising this issue publicly and internationally. And of course, as a result of the backlash from it, the European Parliament passed a resolution condemning the state of democracy in Serbia, taking Belgrade elections as an example. And who played a very big role in voting this resolution in the European Parliament? Everybody advertised that. German MPs, including the MPs from the ruling at that time, Social Democrats and the German Greens. Couple of months later, what happens? Olaf Scholz comes to Belgrade, signs a memorandum of rare earths, and all of a sudden no one talks about Belgrade elections nor about the European Parliament resolution. So I would say that this has been a perfect case study example of how, again, what I have mentioned during this morning's panel about the declining credibility of the European Union, saying one thing and doing something else completely different. And that's perhaps one of the messages, because some people have asked me, will the support that the Russians have extended to Vučić during these protests lead in some damage to Russia's credibility? I say yes, but your credibility will be more damaged because of your business dealings. Why? Because Russians don't talk about values, they talk about interests. So people who look at it, common Joes, they will hold the Europeans to a different set of criteria, a different set of accounts than the Russians.
The lithium case is very interesting. I hope I won't sound a bit cynical about the whole thing, but there a few things about I mean, the first thing is if you go to the area where the lithium deposits are and the mines are supposed to be, it takes you about 30 seconds to understand that that's not going to happen. I mean, this is a territory of small agricultural owners. They don't care about China, they don't care about lithium, they don't care about European Union, they care about their potatoes and tomatoes and their 2 acres of land, and they will fight against anybody. And it's just obvious visually. You sit there, look, and say, well, you can't remove these people from here. So anybody who is having these negotiations, I would advise to just take the car, go there, have a look, come back, and then continue the negotiations. The other thing about the lithium is that it's very much like hydrogen. I mean, some people decided that hydrogen is a few years ago, is the solution for everything. Only to read, several years later, to read a few articles and understand that hydrogen is dead end for about 90% of the technologies, that it's not going to go in transport, it's not going to go in heating, it's not going to go in electricity production. It is mainly going to go where hydrogen is going at the moment now. So lithium is very similar. I mean, there is plenty of lithium everywhere. And it's not about the deposits of lithium. It's about the purification and of lithium. I mean, also, only 20% of lithium, I think, comes from China. Large part comes from Australia. It could come from anywhere. You need to have the technologies, the production lines for its purification, production, making it into batteries, and all that. So it's like having, I don't know, fertilizers and claiming that you're selling pizzas. I mean, there is a long way between one and the other. So that's about this case. If I want to tell a story about Chinese influence here, do I have the time for that?
Depending on the story.
It's a lovely story. I think it's a story that tells almost everything about. You know that there is a French car, Renault Twingo. Yeah, small car. So Renault decided to make a new one, electric, and in order to design it, it went to China and asked China to design it. They opened an office there with 150 engineers, Chinese engineers, and I think 10 French. So exactly the opposite what was happening 10, 20 years ago with China. And so they designed the Twingo, and now this car will be produced in Europe. It will be produced in Slovenia, so in Southeast Europe, and the batteries will come from Hungary, again Southeast Europe. Both countries are part of CEE region, so this is the Southeast European energy region. So it's a very, very interesting case in which we suddenly see that China is the source of innovation. China is the source of design. The batteries that will be produced in Hungary, they were produced by a Chinese company, but the final share of European content will be 60%, and the Chinese will be 40%. And I think this is one scenario for the future. It's not the only scenario, but it's one scenario in which you see a model of cooperation between Europe and China that could work and which is not confrontational. Of course, we'll have the confrontational things, we'll have the cybersecurity stuff, we'll have Taiwan, we'll have human rights and many other issues, but this is a very interesting model. The car will cost 20,000 euros, and with the subsidies 15,000 euros, so basically nothing. And the main reason the French company went to China is they wanted the know-how of China for how to get the car very quickly to the market, from concept to production, to do it for 2 years rather than 4 years. And this is what is happening. So we'll see more and more of this also because, and I'll stop here, China is registering more domestic patents than EU, US, Japan, and South Korea put together. So it's a source of innovation, research, and development.
As a way of disclaimer, we're not getting any commission here from Renault.
Not yet, or
No.
from China.
Or from China. Alicia will tell us, hopefully now, the other side of that story. So why this scenario, is this the kind of risk-free scenario?
No, it's not. I mean, I understand that it might be a middle ground to a certain degree, but I think that also knowing the modus operandi of China and the fact that it has, over the past 10 years, entered a very different paradigm when it comes to its own cost and benefit calculation, I think that in this scenario, European firms and subcontractors will still be increasingly potentially the target of Chinese blackmail. As we saw over the past couple of months with what has happened with China announcing the new regulations that in the end did not come into force because of the meeting between Xi and Trump, but this is a tactical pause. China is now very, very conscious that it can blackmail all European firms. And one of the elements of this debate is also about the fact that these regulations would not only influence the green transition or the green technologies, but also defense technologies, and how in the first version of these regulations proposed by China, it was explicit that none of the firms, European firms, that would require a license to use Chinese technologies or elements that were core to the development of defense of the defense industry, none of these firms would be even considered in the process of obtaining a license. And now it seems like everyone somehow is relieved in Europe that this is not happening. But I think that, yes, I understand the pragmatic logic behind this kind of reasoning, but I still feel like it's to a certain degree at that end, that it does not shield us from, in the long run, from these dependencies and how they can be used if push comes to shove, and it can in multiple ways. Unfortunately, because of the fact that the Chinese system is a black box, we don't know how Xi Jinping is thinking. And I'm not saying that we are going to see an escalation in the Indo-Pacific over Taiwan. It can happen. But I think that it's just, we really need to find a way to diversify these partnerships, but also, and here I'm not an expert, and I might be just saying something very, very stupid, but to work more on developing technologies that bypass China in terms of the value chain. And I've heard that this work is happening. I don't know much about it, but I do have a feeling that the way Chinese elites, Chinese political elites think, in the end, it's always about creating these choke points for Europeans and exploiting them when there's a need. And there will be potentially a need because they're in an existential rivalry with the US. That's how they see it.
Any questions, reactions? Yes, please.
Hi, I am Laura from the Danish embassy. So I wanted to ask a few points about the first things that you said, which is not necessarily about the green energy. But in the beginning, you talked about that when we push the Russian oil and gas out, then the US will not step in the gas part on the LNG. You said at least in Europe, and I was just thinking, what about in the Western Balkans? Because here, LNG might also be a substitute for the Russian gas. So that was one thing, and I wanted to hear your take on that one. And then on the Chinese influence, recently there has been this talk about a new refinery in, don't hold me up on this pronunciation, but Tcherneva, yeah. I would like to hear some take on that one, because that's also a new form of maybe Chinese influence where they're stepping in instead of the Russians, or maybe the Americans instead of the importing oil or gas from Europe or from the US. And then last thing, I wanted to hear also again and the Chinese influence, maybe from you, who are an expert in the Chinese affairs. Do you see a pragmatic scenario where there's an area where we can actually cooperate with China and not just have this hardliner position where we have to bypass them in our supply chain? And in what areas could we then allow this? And in what ways? Yes, those were my questions. Thank you.
Excellent questions. Thank you very much. We start with Julian.
So gas
Oil and gas in the Western Balkans.
Yes, gas, oil and gas,
From the
and
US.
refinery. Yes, stopping Russian gas and oil, that does not, I'm not saying that not a drop of American oil or a cubic meter of American gas will come in. But when we talk specifically about gas, the gas consumption in Western Balkans is very, very small. There is some consumption here on the Belgrade central heating, some for industry, but if you look at the numbers, it's very small. Yes, it will be replaced partially by American gas or just imported gas from somewhere. But what I'm saying is that the overall trend in Europe is decline of gas. So for regulatory and market reasons, and Western Balkans can't escape from that because it's not just regulations, but it's market as well. So at the moment, Western Balkans basically don't have solar energy. If you look at the statistic, there is no solar energy. And this will be an avalanche at some point because it's so cheap. And the next will be batteries, and wind is also. And of course, we need grid, which is appearing gradually, but there is fairly well developed, even if it's outdated grid here in the Western Balkans and the connection with the EU. So in that sense, I'm not concerned that 1 or 2 billion cubic meters of gas will come into the Western Balkans from US than from Russia. It's better to come from US than from Russia, but anyway, we're talking about a very small scale. Regarding the refinery and the Chinese interest, it's a very, very interesting question. I mean, my personal view is that anything that comes from China but does not allow ownership of critical infrastructure, ports, grids, and anything that is cyber-proof is actually benefiting us. As a general principle, of course, if Chinese build a lot of things, increase their presence, that's a different type of risk. But otherwise, in terms of technology, when we buy things and when we ask Chinese to develop something, we have to be very vigilant about ownership and control of critical infrastructure and of cyber risk. So anything that comes from China should be subject to a, let's call it digital audit or cyber security audit. It's not always very easy, but if it develops that as a procedure, then the European countries will be fairly protected, including the Twingo. We have to be sure that there's not a little thing inside that tells the Chinese Communist Party what we're talking inside the Twingo, or that she will stop the Twingo on a red light. So, but we can do that. So we have to be careful. So.
Thank you. Vuk, do you know about a refinery in Smederevo? Or do you know anything about this kind of energy context of the Chinese presence here?
Well, I'm not quite sure about the refinery in Smederevo, but of course, I mean, the mentioned solar panels are definitely one of the areas where the Chinese might be eyeing for to penetrate as BRI goes more sophisticated, more next gen, more targeted rather than massive. When it comes to the issue of American LNG, I mean, even at the risk of sounding overly speculative, I wouldn't discount the possibility that perhaps this is one of the reasons why the Trump administration so persistently insists on the sanctions towards Nice. No, not just the restructuring of ownership structure, but full elimination of the Russians. I mean, I remember several months ago when we had talks about Americans taking over one of the rare surviving cracks of the Nord Stream, one of the rare ones which survived. Because we should remember one thing: even in the best case scenario of Trump and Putin leading U.S.-Russia rapprochement, so even in the best case scenario, there was one area in which Trump never liked Russia, and I remember speeches both from his speeches as well as speeches from Richard Grenell during his first term, we are paying for European defense while the Europeans are buying Russian gas and Russian energy. I remember those statements being repeated out frequently. So potentially, yes, energy domain is one of the areas where Trump might be willing to go irrespective of the dynamics of US-Russia bilateral rapprochement and bilateral ties. So that's perhaps the best answer. Sorry for being speculative, sorry for being perhaps incoherent, but with limited information, I think this is the best guess.
No, that's actually quite good. Thanks a lot. So, disputing your hawkishness, what are the areas where we should and could cooperate with China? And if I may add to that question, how can we protect ourselves otherwise?
No, that's a great question. And I certainly agree that, complete decoupling is impossible, and that's not, the case. I think that essentially we're so far ahead, or China is so far ahead in this game, that we are currently at the stage where we as Europeans within the EU, we have to designate the areas that we are still willing to protect and compete with China, and somehow give up on other areas. And this, I understand that at the level of the European Commission, there is an ongoing debate on these issues. But I think that different EU capitals are on very different pages, and it will be very, very difficult to bring them together. And politically, I think it will be also very difficult. But I think that we are already seeing the contours of what we could call Made in China 2035. So by looking at what China is saying at the moment, where they're going to invest over the next 10 years, we can also see where they will be interested in cooperating with Europe. For example, if you look at the latest 5-year plan that was published last month, China is very clear about what areas they want to invest in. And one of them is, for example, aerospace. Aerospace, yeah. China wants to, over the next 10 years, become a dominant force in space and airspace, which also means that one of these remaining competitive industries in which Europe still has a competitive edge could be at stake. And it's been happening for many, many years. China has invested tremendously a lot in it, and they haven't been very successful. But evidence shows us that they are getting so much better at it. And also the language of this new 5-year plan is quite new in a way that they're talking about extraordinary resources that will be put into these dimensions. Also in the semiconductor breakthroughs, biotechnologies, AI, quantum, and still an ongoing process. But I think that, if we take Chinese documents at face value, if we, read them carefully, we can also read, as Europeans, understand where we have to be very, very cautious in cooperation with China, not to repeat the same solar panels EV story again, or in the next 10 years. Well, anti-coercion instrument, for example, but politically, I don't know whether this is ever going to happen.
I think it's quite obvious that one instrument is investment in R&D and education. And here, this is very relevant for Western Balkans, but not only for Western Balkans, for almost the entire Central and Eastern Europe, because Central and Eastern Europe is dragging down the European Union in terms of investing R&D investment. And we're now behind in terms of percentage of GDP. We're behind China. And we had in 2020, I think, we had this objective to reach 3% of GDP in R&D. We're still at 2%. China is above that. So, and the main reason is in Central and Eastern Europe, which is some countries like Bulgaria, most of the Western Balkan countries, I think, is under 1%. 1% is just basically eco-zero, because that covers the electricity bill and the minimum salaries of some people. So we must increase not just public, but also develop policies for increasing the investment in R&D, and I would say even make it a condition for accession.
Just given that, going off Julian's last point, and also the economics of the whole lithium thing, because on the EV front, if I understand things correctly, even before today's panel, and now it's reinforced, I mean, I think Europe catching up on that front ain't going to happen. I don't think America's going to do it either. That was snoozing at the wheel and sticking with what people had, as well as other complacency. So trying to understand the lithium mining project here through that perspective, I wanted to just sort of posit something provocative and see how people think, whether they think it's plausible or me just talking crap. From my perspective, it looks mainly, the German engagement in particular, looks mainly aimed at a domestic political audience in Germany to say we're trying to save the German car industry, which is already going to be outcompeted on the electric vehicle front. No way it could catch up at a price point that's going to be competitive on a consumer side. So this is all about domestic political marketing rather than actually accomplishing something.
Anyone? I think it's more complicated even than that, because the German domestic debate is actually about das Auto. It's about the engine, the gasoline engine, right? Mm-hmm. And it's not about the EVs or the lithium. So it's one step behind what you're describing. But I don't know if any of my co-panelists would like to.
This might not be a directly linked to Germany, but it's just a thought that I had also about the fact that in Europe, I think when we think about competition with China in the EV sector or the automotive connections between Germany and China and how it affects Europe, we have a tendency to think about cars as just cars. You know, we know how a car looks like. But the cars, the real EVs, not the hybrid plug-ins, because the Chinese EVs that we're seeing at the moment here in Europe, they're not still the same cars as in China. If you look at how they look like, the actual EVs that are used in China at the moment, they're offering a whole ecosystem of an experience. It's a very, very different type of machine. It's not a car. It's kind of an innovation of the future that it's a very futuristic thing. And there are varying levels of appetite, I think, when it comes to using this kind of innovations in Europe. And there are countries, I think Germany might not be among those who are the most open to this kind of an experience. Poland, I think that actually on the opposite end, Polish people are quite keen to accept innovation. So I think that the very fact that we're seeing these Chinese EVs on our roads, coupled with the fact that they are cheaper and they are attractive, I think that we are kind of entering a phase where some countries might very quickly embrace these technologies and increasingly an ecosystem of that changes kind of the way we think about cars and how we use them. And that's kind of the debate of the future. And I think that Germany is very much not out there when it comes to thinking about it in this way.
Yes, that's very, very interesting and important. The new concept of a car that is coming from there. In terms of instruments and other policies, I mentioned R&D. But we have to think about what are the options for sort of developing policies for European origin? I know that this is getting into clash with World Trade Organizations, free markets, and so on, but there are many ways of doing it, and probably we need some list, some taxonomy of measures. So there is no one approach that will protect us, but we should go through defense industry, bio-industries, and so on, and see what we can protect and how we can protect it, and in what way, because there are many different ways. So one way, for instance, is reducing, this is more relevant to the European Union at the moment, but to protect the export of scrap metals, for example, because keeping scrap metals in gives an opportunity, better opportunity to electrify metal production, because it's not a primary metal, it's a recycled metal. It could be recycled with electric. So that can boost, tiny little bit can push the whole electrification agenda, and anything to do with electrification, because this is one of the competition ground, the level of electrification. But electrification in the European Union as a final consumption is around 21%. In China is 31%, growing by 1% every year. It's a very rapidly fast electrification country. So anything that's electrification, anything that can help electrification, whether it's a scrap metal, whether it's heat pumps, whether it's cars, and so on, has to be considered to go into this taxonomy. And one of the things that is being, with the German car industry, especially in Italy, and also is the ban on new electric cars from 2035. I mean, it's seen as something that will kill the European car industry. Well,
Diesel cars.
No, petrol car, internal combustion engines.
You said new electric cars.
Ah, sorry. The internal combustion engine, sir. So the ban of selling internal combustion engine cars from 2035 will, in my view, it's a speculative view, but it's will not kill the European car industry. It will give a chance for the European car industry to compete, or at least to catch up, because it will force the car industry to get out of the internal combustion engine, which is quite clearly something that we're moving out of it. And if we keep the internal combustion engine, we'll just prolong this. And of course, we can have niche companies that are producing only, I don't know, internal combustion engine or steam engine cars or whatever. I mean, there are in England, there is a steam engine competition on the roads, but this is sort of a very nostalgic thing and serving kind of an active nostalgia experience rather than the mass market and technology and competition.
Great. Last question to Vuk, and we close it very quickly. If China is replacing Russia as kind of main actor globally, in the Western Balkans we see also Russia's imprint declining on the energy front. But in general, I think also on the security and political front, how do you think the Chinese presence is going to continue, and how would policymakers here view China, especially vis-a-vis, its industrial and competitiveness assets?
China is too far away to be deemed as a security threat here, and the knowledge of people about China is very, very limited. And of course, someone in city of Leskovac will say, I mean, Taiwan, Uyghurs, so what? I mean, that's not my backyard, that's not my concern. At the same time, where do I see the future of it all? I do see the future. I believe that Russian and the Chinese influence will not necessarily disappear, even if Vucic is replaced tomorrow. I think that what the Russians and the Chinese will lose in case Vucic goes down, the Russians will lose a propaganda, media, and tabloid machinery which glorifies them and advertises the Russians across the regions. Chinese will lose a partner which allows them to do whatever they want in the communities in which they invest. But at the same time, we still have to be mindful of three things that will still be there. There will still be a cynicism regarding the West, so this gives Russia and China some leeway. There will still be this little thing called the unresolved Kosovo dispute. And you will still have a society which will be hungry for capital and infrastructural work. So China will still potentially be there in that particular context. But as I said, the main dilemma will be once American-China rivalry comes to the fore. That will be the agenda shaper and agenda setter.
Thank you very much. I think this was a very interesting discussion. You should not necessarily buy a Renault Twingo, but it's a good European project. With some caveats.
I'm not buying it. I'm not buying it, but
Thanks a lot, and thank you to our panelists.